We're going to explore if ayahuasca is helpful in understanding the ego. So let's just take a good deep breath together because this is a big topic. And I mostly want to share it directly from my own experience because I'm super clear that whenever we assume that we understand something completely, then we're no longer able to learn from it. So here I'm going to say that there are many different kinds of understandings about the ego. And some of that we're going to have to set aside. So let's let the ego not be a good or a bad thing. Perhaps let it be something neutral. In many spiritual circles, specifically in non-duality, there's been many people who will do a deep investigation and come out with the result that the ego is non-existent. So, perhaps that is true, but what we have to go by is our own experience. Now, the idea that the ego is non existent can have some extreme consequences to that. On the one hand, we can fall into spiritual bypass, in this holding of everything going on about us is non existent and bypass into some other kind of state. And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing. There isn't anything wrong with it all. Anything. It all has its place. And then on the other end of talking about the ego, it can get a very bad rap, and that it's something that you need to get rid of, get into shape, do all of these different things with to make it a better ego. So let's just say here to start out, that perhaps the ego doesn't exist, and perhaps it does. And maybe it exists for a good reason. Perhaps it has a function. So I'm going to present to you the idea that the ego is a protective mechanism, is a good friend, something that has come into our system, our psychology, our emotionality, our body, our psychic, for a reason. And often when we're feeling like in the ego, we're in a place of protection, of defense. And in that, there's a sense of feeling disconnected, fragmented, really split, where you can essentially only focus on the so called me. It's very self centered, very self consuming. I'm sure that people have experiences of this where you're consumed by the thoughts in the mind and feel disconnected from feelings, from your body, from the environment around you, from the life around you. So I'm going to say that that's happening though for a good reason. And the purpose of the ego in this sense is to keep us safe. So when egoic reaction has come into place, it's usually because an early wounding that hasn't yet had an opportunity to heal, to resolve itself, where there's unconscious material that hasn't had a chance to come into the light of consciousness, is causing us to behave in a variety of different ways. So in that sense, ego is kind of trying to maintain some sense of safety, some sense of preventing whatever that wounding was, whatever that painful experience was, or perhaps many, from repeating itself. So, as a strategy, that's a very healthy strategy. So, there's an intelligence within that. So, ego's not a bad thing. Think of it as the friendly ghost. Perhaps you can't put your finger on it directly, but you can feel the energy of it when it's triggered, when it's operating, when it's kind of masking something else. And sometimes this can be very strong. So we call it ego identification. So now let's go to ayahuasca. Now, ayahuasca is a plant medicine that I'm quite familiar with. And I'm also going to say that I'm not going to assume that I know everything about ayahuasca because surely I do not. So, again, I can just share from my own experience. My experience is mostly with the Quechua tradition and more so with the Shipibo tradition in the jungle in Peru. So I've had many opportunities, many, to sit with ayahuasca. And ayahuasca has compounds in it that are actually similar to compounds that we have in our own body. So when we're in a situation of safety, people, ayahuasca in itself is a huge topic. So you can go to this channel. I have more information on ayahuasca and stay tuned because I will be bringing on guest speakers and we'll be having conversations where we'll go in much more depth. So there isn't time in this particular program for that. But stay tuned, check out the other videos, go to my website. There's a lot of really good information around about the efficacy of plant medicine. But right now, in that, don't forget to subscribe and like, share if you like the content of what's being presented. But ayahuasca is a plant medicine that has been used for thousands of years. Now, in the Shipibo tradition, it is part of their healthcare system. It's very kind of a holistic approach where it's integral to their lifestyle. And indigenous people have such a connection to plants in a way that I could not pretend that I understand that fully. But I do know that the compounds in ayahuasca are similar to the compounds in our own body. So if a person is drawn to ayahuasca, they're usually drawn because they're interested in healing something. There's so much suffering in our world and for so many people, and suffering in and of itself, what's representative is disconnection, fragmentation, feeling lost, not knowing who you are. All of these kinds of things are usually what draws somebody to spiritual practice, to working with plant medicine s- for healing. So I was with the Shipibos in the jungle in Peru at a very reputable place called the Temple of the Way of Light. After I was working with the Quechuas, then I went on to work with the Shipibos. And I really love this place. It's held very responsibly. Now, I say that because if we're going to be able to understand egoic function and what it's actually protecting, what is the wounding, the fragmentation, the disconnect, what is that pain that it's masking? There has to be safety. Safety is the very first thing. Calling it ego now, but you could also call this a trauma response. When the ego is triggered, it's triggering a trauma response. So, in order for any healing to happen, for any growth or any development to take place, we have to feel safe. We have to be in an environment and a place of holding so that whatever it was that happened in the course of our development, or maybe that we even carry with us as a karmic load from prior lives or from our ancestry, in order for that unconscious material to come into the light of consciousness, we have to be able to have a certain degree of resting, of settling in our bodies. And that settling happens when we feel safe. So I was at this Temple of the Way of Life in a Maloka and all prepared for an upcoming ceremony. Now, at this particular time, it was quite some time ago, I was also working on writing a book. So we had our time during the day was free, and I chose to take that time in isolation or to work on my book that I was writing. So I had my computer with me, which is a kind of odd thing to travel into the jungle with your laptop. But I did this many times because I was able to get a lot of time where I wasn't distracted by the life that I have here in my house with my family and children. So I got a lot of really good writing done there. And on one particular evening, we're it's all sitting around in the Maloka. And how these ceremonies there are set up is that you have, well, almost, well, I'd say 6 feet, not quite like what we're needing to do right now, but about 2 to 3 feet between each other in a mat. And you have your own sitting place because ayahuasca is an inner journey, that doesn't only happen when you're there on the mat, but it really begins when you make the choice or you feel the calling to come and work with this very profound medicine. And then it continues into how that gets integrated in your life. So, ayahuasca is a journey, it's not a trip. So, I was, amidst a very long journey with ayahuasca for many years. And so I came to sit on my mat and prepare for the ceremony. Now, before that, before it got dark, because there wasn't electricity very much in the jungle where we were, so I needed to bring my computer into the village to have it charged. So I would have it get charged overnight so that I could use it during the day. So in this particular ayahuasca ceremony, I was feeling this resting in myself and feeling the medicine operate, move around. There were some visions. I purged. I usually would purge fairly early, and purging happens in a number of different ways, lots of energy moving. But then at a certain point, it was as if, because ayahuasca is like a huge magnifying glass, like holotropic. It magnifies everything in your interior life, the psychology, the psychic. So it's like bringing a magnifying glass into all of those places that are unconscious and haven't been seen yet. So here the light is being shined on my mind, and a loop started to happen that was saying that my computer in the village was being hacked, like it was being stolen and hacked, and all of my information on there was being stolen, my bank accounts, and all of this. And this was spinning in my mind, and I believed it. And this was super magnified. I couldn't help myself, and I couldn't choose not to believe it. It was automatic. So I started to, shine my little light to ask for assistance because I felt that I needed to go into the village immediately and get my computer. I was 100% convinced of it. So I was telling this to the facilitator because you speak to a facilitator, not the actual curandero. And they were saying, something to me like, we can't do that right now. You're in ceremony. You're in ceremony. But it wouldn't stop. This movement of the mind and the believing in it just went on and on and on. And I became very desperate because I was so hooked into believing that my computer wasn't safe. Therefore, I wasn't safe. And something about me was being seriously violated. So that went on, and they had a medical come over to work with me and blowed all kind of smoke and sang an ikaro, which is the healing energy of the plant. And eventually a calming was able to happen. And then I was laying down on my mat toward the end of the ceremony, and I just broke out in a laughter, a belly laugh, a deep cracking open laughing, because she showed me, ayahuasca showed me the mechanics of the mind very vividly, very clearly, how one thought can begin to move in the mind. And as soon as that thought is believed, an entire world is created around it. And then we perceive the world through that lens, through whatever it is we're believing, that becomes the lens in which we perceive life through. So the lens there was telling me not safe, no, a violation is happening, and we need to do something about it. And I was so laughing because I knew that, I came back, the medicine wore off, and I came back down, and I got to see that that was a magnification of how the egoic sense of self happens because it is protecting a wound. So for me, as I continue to reflect on this, because when you're in that wounding, when you're in that believing, when you're in that trauma response, that egoic identity, there isn't a capacity available to self reflect. So that came later, and I was able to reflect and listen and see that that was showing me that there was a thread of belief that was still attached to an earlier violation in my life, which was actually quite painful. And it hadn't come yet to the surface and to the light of consciousness to be able to be seen as something that, yes, at the time was very painful, but it was over, it's past, a past experience. And I was able to let the feelings of that, the wounding, the sadness, the old, grief, the loss of my innocence, of something really dear and innocent, for that to be able to soften and heal and let the energy of all of that transmute in my body so that I could befriend and connect to this almost like an orphaned place in myself that was, kind of suppressed and distant and hanging out in the cold. So she, the ayahuasca, allowed a rejoining of this innocence to rejoin the wholeness, the totality of who I am, and for a harmonization and an integration to happen so that that thread of belief about safety, about violation, was able to soften and shift the lens in which I was perceiving life through. Yeah. So when we're in trauma response, or when we're hooked into a core belief or wound, we're disconnected and we can't really see reality as it actually is. So, to answer the question, is ayahuasca beneficial to understand the ego? Yes, very much so. To see that the ego is a gift, is a endearing function. It's a function, a structure that you may not be able to put your hands on directly, but it has served a very good purpose so that when it's activated, it's has an intelligence within it that is wanting to bring some information forward. It's wanting to bring something that's unconscious into consciousness So if we can see ego or our traumatic responses, if we can befriend them and see that there's no accident, that they're here, that they can be a helper, there's a jewel in it, and it can inform a very deep healing process where something that may have felt disconnected can rejoin, can come home to where it belongs and can once again feel safe, feel its innocence, harmonize with the totality of you. So, ayahuasca is quite brilliant in this way. It's like a surgeon, that knows right where to go and goes there when you are ready. And the readiness happens in the preparation for the journey and being in an environment where there is safety, the setting is right, the people who are administering the medicine are well trained and they're responsible and they're connected to an indigenous tradition. And they've also done, a good deal of their own inner work. And does the inner work ever end? I mean, like, really, if you say in non dual spirituality, that there is essentially, in the absolute truth, there is no separation. There's only unity, oneness. So, in that sense, we're infinite. So, the interior and the exterior are the same, not different. So, life is always reflecting back to us, or we're reflecting to life our what we are, our sameness. So, if there's work to be done out there, there's work to be done in here. If there's work to be done in this interior life, then it impacts what's going on out here. So there's what do you want to call it, an ani, a reciprocity of relating. And so how we relate to ourselves and to our, what if you want to call it, ego, is a direct reflection of how we relate to everyone and everything. So when we can befriend everything about us that we might not even be aware of, but when we're in a friendly environment, it's much more apt that those things that are unconscious will come to the surface. And there's many tools. Ayahuasca is one of them and quite brilliant. But I want to let you know that I have some upcoming conversations where I'm going to be speaking with some people that I have great respect for that have worked with plant medicine for a very long time, have lived in the jungle for a long time, and I might even be able to get some of my teachers, some of my very favorite medicos on for a conversation and utilize a translator. So I want to bring this to you because there is some information out that, may not, you know, bring to mind some of the care that is necessary in working with plant medicine. It's not at all recreational, but it's more about medicine, really medicine and healing and connecting and harmonizing and being on this journey we call life and seeing how can we be on it in a way that feels harmonious and connected and in right relationship with all that we meet. So I hope that this is useful to you. Please like, share if you do. Thank you so much for being here.